On a Sunday in May of 1994, a woman took a walk in Central Park. It was a walk she had taken thousands of times, across 30 years of living in the same apartment on Fifth Avenue, directly across from the park. She knew every path. She had pushed her children in strollers down these paths. She had walked them alone, in enormous sunglasses, when she needed to disappear from a world that never stopped watching her. But this walk was different, because on this Sunday she could not walk very far, and she could not walk alone. She was supported, step by careful step, by the arm of the man beside her, her companion of the last decade, Maurice Templesman. She had lost weight. Her speech had slowed. Walking had become difficult. The most photographed woman in the world was dying, and she knew it. Her name was Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, and within 72 hours of that final walk in the park, she would be gone. Dead at 64, in her own bed, in the apartment she loved, surrounded by the very few people she had allowed close enough to be there. The world knew Jackie Kennedy, or thought it did. It knew the pink suit in Dallas. It knew the veiled widow holding the hands of two small children at the most famous funeral in American history. It knew the glamorous First Lady who had restored the White House, who had charmed presidents and kings, who had given the nation the word Camelot to describe the brief, shining 1,000 days of her husband's presidency. It knew Jackie O, the sunglasses, the shipping magnate, the paparazzi, the icon. But the world did not know the woman who took that last slow walk in the park, because Jackie Kennedy spent the final chapter of her life doing the one thing the world had never allowed her to do. She lived privately. The final 20 years of her life, after the assassinations, after the second marriage, after the decades of being the most watched woman on earth, were, by her own fierce design, the years nobody saw. She built a quiet life, a real one, a career she was proud of, a love that asked nothing of her but her company, a peace she had been denied since she was 34 years old, and the world shattered around her in an open car in Dallas. I am Mary, and today, this channel is going to tell you about the part of Jackie Kennedy's story that the endless documentaries about Dallas and Camelot always rush past. Not how her husband died, how she lived, and how she died when the cameras finally, mostly, looked away. The last days of Jackie Kennedy, and what nobody saw. To understand the peace Jackie found at the end, you first have to understand everything she survived to get there. 2 assassinations, a second marriage the world judged cruelly, and a decision, made in her mid-40s, to finally build a life on her own terms. A decision that shocked everyone who thought they knew her. How Jackie Kennedy rebuilt herself from the most famous widow in the world into something the world never expected is coming. The widow who went to work. To understand the peace Jackie found at the end of her life, you have to understand the storm she walked through to reach it. By the time she was 45 years old, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis had buried 2 husbands and lived through violence that would have destroyed almost anyone. The first loss the whole world watched. On November 22, 1963, she was sitting beside her husband in an open car in Dallas when he was assassinated. She was 34 years old. In the space of a few seconds, the young, glamorous First Lady became the most famous widow on earth, and she held the nation together with a dignity that became legend. The veil, the 2 small children, John Jr.'s salute. She choreographed a funeral that gave a shattered country a way to grieve, and she did it while carrying a grief more private and more terrible than any of them could imagine. Then, less than 5 years later, in June of 1968, her brother-in-law Robert Kennedy, the man who had become her protector, her closest confidant in the family, the person she leaned on after Dallas, was assassinated too. And that second murder broke something loose in her. She said it herself, in words that reveal exactly how frightened she had become. If they're killing Kennedys, then my children are targets. I want to get out of this country. If they're killing Kennedys, She was not being dramatic. She had already watched 2 of them shot. She was a mother of 2 young children, and she had come to believe, with good reason, that the Kennedy name itself was a death sentence, and that her son and daughter wore it. So she did the thing that shocked the world and scandalized it. In October 1968, she married Aristotle Onassis, the Greek shipping magnate, one of the richest men alive. He was 23 years older than she was. He was not handsome, not charming in the Kennedy way, not anything the public wanted for their Camelot queen. The press was cruel. The woman who had been America's grieving saint was suddenly recast as greedy, cold, a gold digger who had sold Camelot for a Greek fortune. They did not understand what she understood. Onassis offered something the Kennedy world never could: escape. Money beyond imagining, yes, but more importantly, private islands, security, distance from America and its guns and its cameras. Onassis could protect her children in a way no one else could. For a terrified mother, that was worth more than her public image. The marriage was not a fairy tale. By the time Onassis died in 1975, the relationship had cooled, and there were tensions and grief around his final years. But when he died, Jackie was widowed for the 2nd time, and she was only 45 years old. Twice widowed. Both husbands gone. Her children growing up. The world still watching, still judging, still waiting to see what the famous Jackie would do next. And here is where her real story, the story nobody tells, actually begins. Because Jackie Kennedy Onassis did something that no one expected of a woman of her status, her wealth, her fame. She got a job. In 1975, at the age of 45, one of the wealthiest and most famous women in the world walked into the offices of Viking Press in New York and became a working book editor, an entry-level consulting editor, 4 days a week. A real job, with a real desk, real manuscripts, and a modest salary she did not remotely need. People were stunned. Why would Jackie Onassis, who could have done anything or nothing at all, choose to work? But for Jackie, it was everything. For the first time since she was a young woman, she had something that was entirely her own. Not a role defined by a husband, not a performance for the public, not the widow or the first lady or Jackie O. A profession, something she was genuinely good at, that engaged her sharp intelligence and her deep love of books and art and history, the things she had cared about long before she ever met a Kennedy. She later moved to Doubleday, where she would work for the rest of her life, and she was not a figurehead. She was a serious editor. She sought out authors, shepherded books from idea to publication, fought for the projects she believed in, and earned the genuine respect of the publishing world, a world that quickly learned she was not a celebrity playing at a job, but a real colleague who did the work. She was, at last, Jacqueline, not Mrs. Kennedy, not Mrs. Onassis, just a woman with a career she had built herself. And it was in this quieter, self-made life, a working woman in New York City, walking to her office, editing her books, that Jackie Kennedy would finally find the 2 things that had been taken from her again and again since Dallas: privacy and love. The last great love of Jackie Kennedy's life was not a president or a billionaire tycoon. He was a short, balding, soft-spoken diamond merchant named Maurice Templesman, and the quiet, devoted relationship they built in her Fifth Avenue apartment was the happiest and most peaceful of her entire life. Who Maurice Templesman was, and the love that finally gave Jackie the calm she had been searching for, is coming. The last great love. The last great love of Jackie Kennedy's life was not a president. He was not a billionaire tycoon. He was not tall or dashing, or the kind of man the world would have written into her fairy tale. His name was Maurice Templesman, and he was, by every account, the best thing that ever happened to her. Maurice Templesman was a diamond merchant, an international dealer in gemstones, born in 1929 in Antwerp, Belgium, into an Orthodox Jewish family that had fled to New York to escape the rising Nazi threat. He was short, he was balding, he was quiet, cultured, brilliant, and soft-spoken. He was the opposite, in almost every way, of the two famous men Jackie had married, and she had known him for a very long time. They had first crossed paths back in the early 1960s, during the Kennedy administration. Templesman and his wife had even attended a state dinner, where he and Jackie spoke briefly in French and sparked a friendship. He was a Democratic donor, well-connected, a man who moved in serious circles. They stayed in contact over the years, through her marriage to Onassis, through all of it. But it was not until the early 1980s, years after Onassis's death, when Jackie had built her quiet life as a New York editor, that the friendship became something more. By then, Templesman was separated from his wife, and slowly, without fanfare, without a wedding, without ever seeking the world's approval, he and Jackie became partners. He moved into her 15-room apartment at 1040 Fifth Avenue, the home she had bought after Dallas, the home where she had raised Caroline and John, the home she loved more than any other place on earth. And there, for the last decade of her life, Jackie Kennedy was finally, quietly happy. Think about what this relationship was, and what it was not. It was not a spectacle. There was no grand wedding, no magazine cover, no title. In print, Templesman was usually described with careful, distant words: companion, escort, longtime friend. But to everyone who actually knew them, the truth was obvious. Maurice Templesman was Jackie's husband in every way that mattered, except the legal one. He was her partner, her protector, her intellectual equal, and her home. And crucially, he asked nothing of her that she did not want to give. He did not need her fame. He had his own life, his own career, his own accomplishments. He was not marrying Jackie O, or the widow of a president, or a prize to be won. He simply loved the woman, her wit, her mind, her love of art and books and history, her sense of mischief that so few people ever got to see. For the first time in her adult life, Jackie was in a relationship where she was not a symbol. She was not performing. She was not being watched, judged, defined by the man beside her. She was just Jackie, at home, with a man who loved her exactly as she was. They fell into a rhythm of quiet contentment. They read together. He was a lover of poetry, and he would read it aloud to her. They sailed together on his yacht, the Relamar, in the waters off Martha's Vineyard, near the property Jackie had built there, a private retreat, far from the cameras. They shared meals, conversations, long evenings. They lived, in short, like two people who had finally found peace with each other after long and complicated lives. And around this love, Jackie built the fullest private life she had ever known. Her career at Doubleday flourished. She poured herself into books, into causes she cared about. She famously helped lead the fight to save Grand Central Terminal from demolition, using her fame, for once, as a tool she controlled rather than a cage she was trapped in. And then there were the grandchildren. Her daughter Caroline had married and begun a family, and Jackie, who had lost so much, who had watched two husbands die and had feared for her own children's lives, became a devoted, doting grandmother. She had her children grown and safe. She had grandchildren to spoil. She had work she loved, a home she adored, and a man who cherished her. After 30 years of tragedy and spectacle, and grief lived out in front of the entire world, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis had finally, quietly, built exactly the life she wanted. She was in her early 60s. She was healthy, active, still riding horses, still walking in her beloved Central Park, still sharp and engaged and fully alive. She had, at last, arrived at peace, and she had almost no idea how little time she had left to enjoy it. In the autumn of 1993, Jackie was doing one of the things she loved most in the world, riding horses in the Virginia countryside, when a fall and a swollen gland the doctors first dismissed as nothing became the beginning of the end. How the healthiest, happiest chapter of Jackie's life turned, in a matter of weeks, into a fight for survival, is coming. The diagnosis. In November of 1993, Jackie was doing one of the things she loved most in the world. She was fox hunting in the Virginia countryside, riding horses, as she had since she was a little girl, as she had done all her life. Horses were one of her oldest joys, a piece of herself that existed long before the White House, before the assassinations, before she became a symbol. On horseback, in the Virginia hills, she was simply herself. And then she fell. She was thrown from her horse and briefly hospitalized. It seemed minor, the kind of tumble any experienced rider takes over a lifetime in the saddle. But during her stay, the doctors noticed something else, a swollen lymph node in her groin. At first, they were not alarmed. A swollen gland can mean many things, most of them harmless. They believed it was likely the result of an infection, nothing to worry about. But it did not go away. Over the following weeks, into December, her condition changed. She developed other symptoms. And when the doctors looked closer, the harmless explanation fell away, and the real one took its place. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis had cancer. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a cancer of the lymphatic system, the network that runs throughout the body and forms part of its immune defense. It was the kind of diagnosis that changes everything in an instant. One day she was the healthiest she'd been in years, riding, working, walking in the park, living the peaceful life she'd built. The next, she was a cancer patient. She was 64 years old. In January 1994, she began chemotherapy. And here Jackie made a characteristic decision, one that reveals exactly the kind of woman she was. She chose to share her diagnosis publicly. She did not hide it. After a lifetime of guarding her privacy so fiercely, she understood that this news could not be kept secret, and she chose to face it openly, rather than let it become a matter of rumor and speculation. The public statements at first were hopeful, genuinely hopeful. Her longtime spokeswoman and close friend, Nancy Tuckerman, told the press, "There is an excellent prognosis. The doctors are very, very optimistic." And there was real reason for that optimism. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, in many cases, responds well to treatment. People survive it. People live long lives after it. The doctors had caught it. They had a plan, and the early signs were encouraging. Jackie believed she would beat it. And so she did something remarkable, something that tells you everything about her strength and her refusal to be defined by tragedy. She kept living her life. She kept working. Even through the early rounds of chemotherapy, she continued to go to her office at Doubleday, editing her books, engaged with her authors, showing up to the profession she had built and loved. 3 days a week, she was there, losing her hair to the chemo, wearing a wig or a scarf, but present, working, refusing to surrender her life to the disease. She kept walking in Central Park. She kept her rhythm with Maurice. She approached the cancer the way she had approached everything else in her extraordinary life, with dignity, with composure, with a private strength that never asked for pity. For a few weeks, it seemed the optimism might be justified. But cancer does not care about optimism, and Jackie's cancer was moving. By March 1994, the disease had done the thing the doctors had most feared. It had spread. The lymphoma was no longer contained. It had reached her spinal cord and her brain. This was a devastating turn. When lymphoma spreads to the central nervous system, the treatment becomes far more difficult and the outlook far darker. The doctors tried aggressive measures. They placed a tube in her brain to deliver anti-cancer medication directly, a sophisticated therapy, the best medicine of the time could offer. But the lymphoma in her brain did not respond. And now the symptoms of the spreading disease began to show, in ways that were heartbreaking to those who loved her. She began to lose weight. Her speech slowed. She grew less alert. Walking, the simple act of walking that had always been part of her daily life, became difficult. The woman who had been riding horses in Virginia just months before now needed to be supported when she walked. In April, there was another blow. She was hospitalized for a bleeding ulcer. believed to be linked to the harsh chemotherapy treatment, the cure attacking her body even as it fought the disease. The optimism of January was gone. The excellent prognosis had given way to a much harder reality. Those closest to Jackie began to understand what was coming. And Jackie, clear-eyed and courageous as ever, began to understand it too. She had spent her whole life facing the unfaceable with grace. Now she would have to do it one final time. In the middle of May 1994, the doctors delivered the news no one wanted to hear. There was nothing more they could do, and Jackie Kennedy, who had controlled so little about the great tragedies of her life, made a series of quiet, deliberate choices about how she wanted to face her death. The final days, the decisions she made, and the peace with which she met the end, is coming. Coming home. By the middle of May 1994, the doctors had run out of options. The lymphoma, which had already invaded her brain and spinal cord, was found to have returned to her liver as well. And when it reached that point, when the cancer was spreading through the core of her body and her brain at once, the doctors told her the truth she had already begun to sense. The cancer was no longer treatable. There would be no recovery, no remission, no beating it, the way she had believed she might back in January. The disease had won, and all that remained was the question of how she would spend the time she had left. And here, in the final chapter of her life, Jackie did what she had always done. She took control of the one thing she could control, the manner of her leaving. She had prepared for this. Jackie had a living will, a legal document stating her wishes for the end of her life. And her wishes were clear. She did not want to die in a hospital, hooked to machines, her life extended by aggressive measures that could only prolong her suffering without changing the outcome. She had watched enough death. She knew exactly what she did and did not want. So in keeping with that living will, the aggressive treatments were halted. Even the antibiotics for a pneumonia she had developed that week were stopped. There would be no more fighting the inevitable. There would only be comfort and dignity and home. She had entered New York Hospital Cornell Medical Center that Monday for treatment of serious complications. But she did not want to stay there, and on Wednesday evening, at her own request, she was discharged. She was going home. Home to 1040 Fifth Avenue, the 15-room apartment across from Central Park, the home she had bought in 1964 in the raw aftermath of Dallas, when she needed a place to raise her two small children away from Washington and its ghosts. The home where Caroline and John had grown up, the home she had left for Greece and returned to after Onassis died, the home she shared with Maurice, the place she loved more than any other on earth. She wanted to die there, and she made sure that she would. There is a detail from those final days that captures everything about who Jackie Kennedy was. That Sunday walk in Central Park, the one we began this story with. Even as the cancer consumed her, she went to the park. The park had been part of her life for 30 years. The view from her windows, the paths she walked, the green space that was, for a woman who craved privacy, a kind of refuge in the middle of the most crowded city on earth. She could not walk far. She had to be supported by Maurice, step by careful step. But she went. It was, in a sense, her goodbye to the place she loved. By that point, the crowds had begun to gather. As word spread through the city that Jackie Kennedy was in the final stages of her illness, people began to gather on the sidewalks outside 1040 Fifth Avenue. Ordinary New Yorkers, people who had never met her, but had lived their whole lives with her as a presence. The young widow who held the nation together. The first lady who had given them Camelot. The woman who had walked among them in this city for decades. They came to stand a silent vigil, to be near her, to say goodbye in the only way they could. Inside the apartment, in her final days, a small group was allowed close. Not the world, not the cameras, not the press that had chased her for a lifetime. Just the people who mattered. Her children, Caroline and John, were there. Maurice was there, and a few of her closest friends were invited, quietly, to come and say goodbye. One of them was the singer Carly Simon, a dear friend from Martha's Vineyard. Simon later described the scene inside that apartment in words of aching tenderness. She said Jackie looked so beautiful and so regal and so finally at home. Simon held her hand and told her that she loved her. So finally at home. That was the phrase. After a life of spectacle and grief, of being watched and hunted and defined by others, of losing husband after husband and living in fear for her children, Jackie Kennedy was, at the very end, finally at home, surrounded by love, in the place she had chosen, on her own terms. Even Ted Kennedy came. The last surviving Kennedy brother left Washington to visit her one final time in the evening of her last full day. Everything was in place. The people she loved were near. The apartment was quiet. The vigil was gathering outside. And Jackie, conscious, aware, at peace with what was coming, prepared to let go. She had faced down the worst that life could throw at a person, again and again, across 64 years. And now she would face the last thing too, the way she had faced all the others. With grace, and on her own terms. On the night of May 19th, 1994, in her own bed, in the apartment she loved, surrounded by the very few people she had allowed close, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis let go. Her final hours, the way the world responded, and the funeral that laid America's queen to rest beside the president she had buried 31 years before, is coming. The queen is laid to rest. On the evening of May 19th, 1994, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis died in her bed at 1040 Fifth Avenue. She was 64 years old. She had been conscious, by the account of her friend and spokeswoman Nancy Tuckerman, almost to the very end, aware, present, herself. And then, in her final hours, she slipped into a coma, and quietly, peacefully, she was gone. Her daughter Caroline was there. Her son John was there. Maurice Templesman, her companion of the last decade, was there. She died surrounded by the few people she had chosen to let close, in the home she loved, exactly as she had wished. When Tuckerman came out to face the press, she delivered the news in a few simple words, and she added a detail that has stayed with people ever since. Asked whether Jackie had left any final message for the public that had followed her for so long, Tuckerman said, "She had no parting message. No parting message. At first, that can sound sad, but consider what it really meant. Jackie Kennedy had spent 30 years being asked to perform for the public, to be their widow, their icon, their queen, to give them her grief and her glamour and her strength on demand. And at the end, she kept the one thing that was hers. Her death was private. Her last words were for the people in that room, not for the cameras. She left the world exactly as she had tried to live the last 2 decades, on her own terms, with a piece of herself held back that belonged to no one but her. The response was immediate, and it was enormous. The crowds outside her building grew, flowers piled up on the sidewalk, and across the country, a nation that had watched this woman for 3 decades stopped to grieve her. President Bill Clinton spoke for all of them. The day after her death, he said, "Jackie Kennedy Onassis was a model of courage and dignity for all Americans and all the world." He spoke of how she had held a shattered country together in 1963, how she had carried herself through unimaginable loss, how she had become, without ever seeking it, a symbol of grace under the heaviest pressure a person can bear. 4 days later, on May 23, 1994, she was laid to rest. The funeral was held at the Church of St. Ignatius Loyola in New York City, the same church where Jackie had been baptized as an infant and confirmed as a girl. It was a fitting circle. The woman was returned to God in the same place where her life in the faith had begun. The service was, by her family's design, both grand and intimate. It reflected who she was, cultured, literary, private. Her family chose readings and poetry she had loved. Her grandchildren took part. And her son, John F. Kennedy Jr., the little boy who had saluted his father's casket 31 years before, now a grown man burying his mother, spoke spoke about how the family had chosen the elements of the service. He explained that they had tried to focus on three things that defined his mother: her love of words, the bonds of home and family, and her spirit of adventure. Her love of words, home and family, her spirit of adventure. That was how her children remembered her. Not as the pink suit in Dallas, not as Jackie O, but as a mother who loved books, who cherished her family, who had a restless and adventurous soul. And then Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis made her final journey, from New York, back to Washington, back to the place where the most defining tragedy of her life had led her 3 decades earlier. She was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, beside John F. Kennedy, the president she had married as a young woman, the husband she had lost in Dallas when she was 34, the man beside whom she had walked into history, and beside whom she would now rest for eternity. She was laid to rest next to him, and near the graves of the 2 children they had lost in infancy, and near the eternal flame that she herself had chosen to mark his grave 3 decades before. 31 years after she buried her husband, she came to lie beside him. There is something profound in that final choice. Jackie had lived an entire second and third life after JFK, the Onassis years, the editor years, the decade of quiet happiness with Maurice. She had loved again. She had built a whole world beyond Camelot. And yet, in the end, she chose to return to Jack, to rest beside the young president and the young widow they had been. In that brief, shining moment the world would never stop calling Camelot. Maurice Templesman, the man who had given her the happiest, most peaceful years of her life, understood. He did not begrudge her that final return to Arlington. He read a poem at her graveside, and then he let her go, to lie beside the president, as history required. The most famous woman of her age was gone, and the world would spend the next 30 years trying to understand who she had really been. In the years since her death, the legend of Jackie Kennedy has only grown, but the legend often misses the most important truth about her. Because the real triumph of Jackie's life was not Camelot, and not the glamour, and not the tragedy the world remembers. It was what she built afterward, in the quiet. What Jackie Kennedy's final chapter teaches us about her, and about what really matters, is coming, what nobody saw. There is a version of Jackie Kennedy's story that everyone knows. It is the version made of famous images, the radiant young First Lady in the White House, the pink suit in Dallas, the veiled widow, impossibly composed, holding the hands of 2 small children, the sunglasses, Camelot, Jackie O. That version is real. But it is also, in a strange way, a prison, because it is a version of Jackie built entirely out of the moments when the world was watching her. It is Jackie as spectacle, Jackie as symbol, Jackie as the thing the public needed her to be. And it misses the most important truth about her life, because the real triumph of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis was not Camelot. It was not the glamour. It was not even the extraordinary dignity with which she carried the nation's grief in 1963. The real triumph was what she built afterward, in the quiet, where nobody was looking. Think about the shape of her life. For her first 34 years, and then through the shattering decade that followed, Jackie was defined almost entirely by the men she was attached to and the tragedies that befell them. She was the senator's wife, the president's wife, the president's widow, the tycoon's wife, the tycoon's widow. Her identity, in the eyes of the world, was always in relation to someone else, usually a powerful man, usually one the world was more interested in than they were in her. And then, at 45, twice widowed, she did something quietly revolutionary. She decided to become herself. She got a job she didn't need, because the work mattered to her. She built a career as an editor and earned real respect for real accomplishment. She found a love that asked her to be nothing but herself. She fought for the things she believed in, like saving Grand Central Terminal. She raised her children to adulthood and kept them safe, which had been her deepest fear and her fiercest mission ever since that day in 1968, when she said, If they're killing Kennedys, I want to get out of this country. She became a grandmother. She filled her days with books and art and horses and the people she loved. She took the second half of her life, the half nobody made movies about, and she made it hers. And that is the part nobody saw. That is the part this video has been about. Because the world was so busy remembering the tragedy that it almost missed the recovery. It was so fixated on the young widow of 1963 that it nearly overlooked the fulfilled, self-possessed, quietly happy woman of 1990. The editor, the partner, the grandmother, walking to her office, sailing with Maurice, reading poetry in her apartment above the park. That woman was the real victory. Anyone can be defined by what happens to them. Jackie had more happen to her, more violence, more loss, more relentless public scrutiny than almost any woman of her century, and she could have been destroyed by it. She could have disappeared into grief, or bitterness, or the hollow role of a professional widow, trading forever on the worst day of her life. She refused. Instead, she did the hardest thing a person who has been defined by tragedy can do. She built something new. She reclaimed her own life, piece by piece, out of the wreckage. And she guarded that reclaimed life fiercely, privately, letting the world keep its legend of Jackie O, while she quietly lived as Jacqueline, the woman, not the symbol. This is why the detail of her death is so perfect and so moving. No parting message. Of course there wasn't. The whole point of the last 20 years of her life was that some things belonged to her alone. She had given the public everything, her youth, her grief, her image, her privacy, for decades. At the end, she kept what was left. Her death, like the best parts of her life, was private, hers. And there is a lesson in that, for all of us, that has nothing to do with wealth or fame or Camelot. It is this: you are not only what happens to you, you are also what you choose to build afterward. Jackie Kennedy lost more than almost anyone, in the most public way imaginable, and she still managed to construct, in her final decades, a life of meaning, love, work, and peace. She proved that even after the worst has happened, even after the whole world has decided who you are, you can quietly, stubbornly, become who you actually want to be. That is not the story the legend tells, but it is the truer story, and it is the better one. So when we remember Jackie Kennedy, when the documentaries replay Dallas one more time, when the magazines run the pink suit and the veil again, there is a question worth asking about what we choose to see and what we choose to forget is coming. Let me tell you what this video has actually been about. It has not been about Dallas. Every telling of Jackie Kennedy's story begins and ends in the same place. The open car, the pink suit, the 6 seconds that changed American history. That day defined her in the eyes of the world. It made her an icon. It made her a symbol. It made her, forever, the young widow of the murdered president. And it is precisely because the world can never look away from that day that it so rarely sees the rest of her. This video was about the rest of her. It was about the woman who took the second half of her life, the half that came after the cameras had gotten what they wanted from her, and quietly built something the world never expected. A career she was proud of, a love that let her be herself, a home she adored, grandchildren she doted on. 20 years of hard-won, fiercely guarded peace. And it was about the way she died, not as a spectacle, not as a symbol, but as a woman, at home, in her own bed, surrounded by the few people she loved, having made every choice about her own ending that she was able to make. She came home to die. She kept her final words for the people in the room. She left no parting message for the public, because after a lifetime of giving the public everything, she had finally earned the right to keep something back. That was Jackie Kennedy's real victory. Not surviving Dallas, though she did. Not carrying the nation's grief, though she did that too. Her real victory was refusing to let the worst thing that ever happened to her become the only thing she ever was. Now, I want to leave you with 2 questions. The first, we remember Jackie Kennedy almost entirely for her tragedies and her glamour. for the things that happened to her, and for how beautiful she looked while they did. But the part of her life she was proudest of, the part she built herself, is the part we mostly forget. Why do you think that is? Why does the world find a woman's tragedy more memorable than her triumph, her grief more interesting than her recovery? And what might we see differently, in her and in others, if we looked at the quiet victories instead of the loud losses? Tell me what you think. And the second, gentler question. Jackie Kennedy spent the last 20 years of her life proving that you are not only what happens to you, that even after devastating loss, even after the whole world has decided who you are, you can still, quietly, build the life you actually want. Is there someone in your own life, maybe even yourself, who has done that same quiet thing, who took a life that was broken open by loss, and slowly, stubbornly, built something good out of what was left? Because if there is, then you already understand the real story of Jackie Kennedy. Not the pink suit, not the veil, not Camelot. The woman who walked, slowly, on the arm of the man she loved, through the park she adored, one last time, and then went home, on her own terms, to rest. The world remembers the Queen of Camelot. This video was about the woman who, when Camelot was finally over, quietly went and built a life that was entirely her own. And that, not the crown, not the tragedy, not the legend, is what made her truly extraordinary. Her name was Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. And now you know what nobody saw. This is Mary of Shadows. Thank you for being here.